welcome everybody for joining this morning's webinar hosted by CriticalArc today. I'm delighted to introduce you to our guest panelists on today's webinar. But before we get into the specific subject matter for the webinar, just a couple of housekeeping points. We do have a Q&A bar within the Zoom webinar itself. So please do post any questions that you've got that you'd like to pose to Mal and Jeff, and we'll address those questions at the end of the webinar session. Just before we get into the specific topics that we're going to cover on the webinar now, perhaps first, Mal, could I ask you just to briefly give us all a quick overview and summary of your career experience and what's led you to your current role, and perhaps a brief summary and introduction to the university that you work for those attendees that are unfamiliar with you.
Yeah, thanks, Ian, and it's really great to be involved with this with Jeff as well, and really happy to spend the time to have a chat. I have spent 30 years in security and policing, and took up a role essentially heading up security at Deakin University in Australia, in Victoria, about 14 months ago. That was after 13 years at the University of Melbourne in a very similar role. And it's really quite interesting because I know Jeff's had a very similar experience quite recently, that hearing that and understanding the differences in those two different universities and the way that they work is it's very helpful when I'm dealing with, my peers, and having an understanding of how that might play out at other universities. The reason I ended up at Deakin is an entirely selfish reason, and it's because I'm 4 minutes from home now, after having spent a better part of a decade traveling an hour and a half each way to get to work. So it's it's a lifestyle decision, but I've got to say I'm absolutely thrilled to actually take the role up. It's a dynamic role, and it's quite challenging in its own right too.
Great. Thanks very much. And Jeff, maybe a quick summary of your career background to date and where you're currently working.
Yeah, good morning to all the UK members, and good evening to all our Australian colleagues. Welcome to you all. My name's Jeff Brown. I am the Head of Community Safety and Campus Security at the University of Leeds. Bit of career, 30 years in the police, 20 years in West Yorkshire Police, 10 years in North Yorkshire Police. Then I moved into higher education at the University of York. I was a security manager, and that role particularly changed as a result of moving away from traditional security of asset management into a more student-led welfare and safeguarding role. And the role changed from being a security team to a campus safety team. I decided to move to Leeds in September, or the move took place in September this year. Very different university, 40,000 students at Leeds, 10,000 staff, and it is a city centre university, research, and very similar issues that York, Leeds, and all of the universities have, but they deal with them slightly differently. But it is, a challenge, and I'm looking forward to it.
That's great. Thank you both. And of course, as we get into the subject matter of managing large-scale events and critical incidents, just on the back of, across the UK and large parts of the UK as well, of quite a significant extreme weather event that saw lots of public accessible spaces, including university campuses and the like, having to close as a result of quite significant storms. But we're going to get into some of the best practices associated with managing large-scale protests, looking at things like lessons learned associated with critical event management across public accessible spaces, including healthcare and higher education, as well as the sort of legislative environment in both Australia and New Zealand, and of course with the impending protection of public premises legislation, otherwise known as Martin's Law. So just with that, as we get into some of the topics, Mal, can maybe you just give us a sense of the sort of current landscape around managing critical events in Australia, in your particular university, and perhaps I guess given where you referenced just before we joined the webinar, there have been a number of incidents that have occurred even within the last 6 months, etc. How's that framing some of the thinking and the ways in which both operators, owners of public spaces need to protect their communities?
Here, and I mean, clearly we're looking toward the UK at the moment with regard to where Martin's Law is through the, through the passage through Parliament and so forth. But I think that the Australian counterterrorism and crowded places protection is a federal government purview within Australia. I sit on a counterterrorism crowded places business advisory group and represent higher education, and that is clear. A clear march, if you like, toward protecting that in a more legislative framework and making sure that we're covered off. And it will be a very similar thing to like Martin's Law. I mean, obviously we have things like duty of care and so forth anyway, but there's clearly been a number of incidents that have focused the mind of the governments, and I mean state and territory governments as well as the federal government. We've seen in shopping centres and so forth, and it's not it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see how that might play out in a university environment or a healthcare environment as well. And that's leading the conversation. The terrorism risk rating in Australia was increased in the middle of the year. Clearly, our intelligence services are seeing that there are risks around that. They are telling us that will be probably a relatively young person with access to very low level weapons and might undertake a lone wolf attack. And we've seen that play out. And I think that's the key driver to a lot of the legislative thinking that's going on at the moment. But it's interesting you mentioned weather, and I don't want to take up too much time before I get on to Jeff, but weather actually plays a significant part in the critical incidents that we deal with, particularly in the northern part of Australia. Cyclones, that kind of stuff. We don't normally get a lot of snow. That's not the issue that we have here, but that actually plays out as well. So it's not just that. It's not just critical incidents around terrorism. It's other things also.
And Jeff, I guess if I come to you, many of the attendees of the webinar will be familiar with Martin's Law, particularly if they're based here in the UK. Can you just give us a sense of some of the conversations that are taking place and the different stakeholders in terms of preparing your particular organisation for the upcoming legislation, some of the things that you need to start considering and preparing for, and how that is taking shape?
Yeah, I can. So as people in the UK will be aware, Martin's Law is going through a in the House of Commons. So Martin's Law is based around the Manchester Arena bombing and the unfortunate murders of 21 individuals at the Manchester Arena in 2007. So Martin's Law is on its third reading in the House of Commons. It then has 3 more readings to go through in the House of Lords, and hopefully it will receive royal assent and become legislation later in 2025. So it relates to public accessible locations and how organisations who have those spaces manage and look after the customers that are going to be there. So from a university point of view, universities and higher education have been identified as being in the enhanced tier. So there are 2 tiers for Martin's Law. If you have a public accessible location that has up to 200 people, then Martin's Law doesn't apply. 200 to 799 people within a space, you need to use the standard tier, and that is for looking after the evacuation, the evacuation, the communications around how we manage that. Universities have been identified as being in the enhanced tier. Okay, so there is a lot of legislation, a lot of work that needs to be done in relation to how we manage those spaces. We have graduations at the moment in Leeds. We have open days. We have events going on. We have support centres. Everything that you can imagine in a small town, small city, all happens in a university environment. So we are looking at the moment at how we manage those in relation to access control, how we manage an event. Do we ticket it? Do we do bag searches? Do we have arches? Each event will be looked at individually as well as the entire site itself. So it is a complex situation. However, I have no doubt that a lot of universities at the moment are already doing those sort of things. Graduations will be ticketed. People will decide whether or not this bag search is ongoing. So one of the things that we really need to look at is how we evidence that, how we record it, what decisions we make, and why we make those decisions. Does that help, Ian?
That's great. And I guess there's a leading question to you both. You know, given this backdrop of legislation at its various stages, is it needed, and why? So Mal, over to you first.
Oh yeah, I think absolutely it is, because I think industry left to its own devices, and I don't mean higher education by any stretch of the imagination, because I think we're actually leading the pack here a bit. But if you were to leave industry to their own devices, it might become a numbers game. It might simply become a what's the cheapest option here, and that doesn't necessarily assuage the level of risk that they might face. I think this focuses the mind on what's actually required and holds people to account. Jeff's right, though. I think there's the good operators within our industries are already seeing the writing on the wall and are incorporating these policies and procedures into the way they actually do things already. And it might just take a few others to catch up a little bit, I think.
Yeah, Jeff, over to you.
Yeah, I agree with Mal. I think higher education is well aware of Martin's Law and the events that we take place within our institutions. So, as I've said, our open days at Leeds, we provide an operational order. We look at the event itself, where it's going to take place, the number of people that are likely to be on our site, where they're going to park, how they're going to get from the car parking to the site, and what's going to go on the site. So we already record that. Martin's Law will make that legislation for people who aren't considering those sort of events. So as part of our higher education, Mal's part of it as well, that there's an association called AUCSO, which is the Association of University Chief Security Officers. We talk on a regular basis about Martin's Law, about security, about events and how we can manage it. So the association is looking to we have a special interest group in relation to it to make sure that all the legislation that's coming up we are aware of, so that we can be at the forefront of Martin's Law in relation to, our students and customers. Everybody, Mal, it doesn't matter where we are in the world, our role is to enhance the student experience, to make the student experience at our universities the best that it can be. So by providing a secure environment for them and making sure that we do that through legislation, will make it a fantastic place to come and study.
Yeah, that's a great point, actually, Jeff, as a reminder to bring us back to, particularly in a higher education setting, what it's all about. So Mal touched on this just as we started the webinar. It feels like there's an ever increasing and diverse range of threats and risks that higher education providers, executive management teams, and members of staff who are responsible for ultimately providing that student experience and keeping communities safe. How has that changed in your career, Mal, and what are the ever evolving sorts of things that organisations are now having to consider in terms of keeping their community safe, and in particular managing some of these new large-scale events that can and often do occur?
I think university management are risk averse by they would always try and do the right thing by, as Jeff just touched on, the main driver perhaps might be that they would be judged basically on not only the quality of their education, but on the safety and the security of the environment for why they would like to spend money on something like Safe Zone as a risk mitigation practice. And I think therein lies what's changed. I think there are a couple of things have changed. One, I think, is that there's technology is increasing, it's improving all the time, and that's a very difficult thing and an expensive thing to keep up with, and to try and keep that under the nose of greater emphasis on the support, the welfare support of students and staff members with the university, and a recognition that there's a significant undercurrent of mental health that needs to be assuaged, or risk of mental health issues being assuaged. And there is a confluence of those things that are actually driving more recognition for the right kind of money to be spent in the right areas to try and assuage risk.
And Jeff, I guess same question to you as well. How have you seen the different types of threat and risk, and how organisations are responding to that? How have you seen that particular sort of threat and risk landscape change over the last period?
Yeah, so when I came into higher education, security was more asset management. It was security guards wandering around universities, checking on buildings, making sure they were secure, making sure that bikes were secure, because, as in Australia and the UK, cycling is big within, university communities. So that was what the priority was. Over the 10 years, things have changed in relation to how students perceive security. Students don't particularly, they do need their assets looking after, but a lot now, because security staff are 24/7, 365 days a year, there are a lot more safeguarding. There are a lot more welfare issues that need to be addressed. So the training for staff has had to change. There is a requirement for staff to understand mental health issues. But the predominant thing that's changed for me is there is an expectation, a fundamental expectation, that students have a right to free speech and freedom of expression. Protest, occupations, industrial action has always taken place. However, that has increased certainly over the last 12 to 18 months, and that has become a difficulty for security staff. A lot of universities within the UK are transforming their security teams into either a campus safety team or a community team or whatever that might be. And it's become increasingly difficult for those staff to try and manage safeguarding and welfare of students and then transform into a police protection in relation to protests, because there are two sides to a protest. Somebody has a positive action, somebody has a negative action, and the security teams are stuck in the middle of that. And the protests, certainly in the UK over the last 12 months, have become extremely difficult for us to be able to manage as a team.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, actually. If I just reflect on some of the news footage that we've seen from various different countries and institutions around the world in response to things like occupations, student protests that have occurred, we see a very different response in different parts of the world. Mal, can you maybe talk about the sort of posture and the philosophical, cultural approach that Australia universities, perhaps generally, and even your particular university take in dealing with large-scale events like student protests, building occupation, that can be, very disruptive, but to Jeff's point, need to be balanced with that, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, that the right to protest as part of that student voice.
I think the way I would describe it in Australia is that most universities are, most university executive and management are happy for students to explore their freedom of expression when it comes to student activism, or there's almost an awakening of political interest when a student enrolls at a university, and executive want universities to be a safe place for you to express those opinions, and are very happy to oblige you in providing an opportunity for you to stay within certain boundaries. And that's played out this year with regard to, encampments that related to the Israel-Gaza scenario, whereby universities probably looked toward the Columbia University scenario in the US and didn't want to intervene negatively to break it up. We're happy to manage it and allow them to have their freedom of speech and so forth, but make sure that there is a safe environment to do that. What we saw play out was as Jeff quite rightly pointed out, there's two sides to that discussion. And I think that we need to make sure that the individuals who want to partake in that protest can actually do that in a safe way, not be influenced by external events and that kind of thing, but also cognizant of the fact that there are people with an opposing view who also need to have an opportunity to do that. And can be a fine line to tread, sometimes a bit of a tightrope. But philosophically, universities are very open to that public speaking, engagement scenario, and allow people to actually have their say, providing you put some boundaries around it. And I think what we saw play out in the US and other places didn't necessarily occur very much in Australia, a little bit, but not very much, because we learned from the mistakes of others potentially, I think.
Jeff, same question to you.
Yeah, I agree with Mal. I think higher education institutes expect freedom of speech, expect people to come out and give their point of views. And like Mal says, there are two sides to the discussion. The issues have come in the UK in relation to the powers that security staff have. In relation to a protest, freedom of speech is fine. It's when it comes to breaking the law, committing criminal damage, trespass or aggravated trespass. And that puts the universities in a really difficult situation. There is legislation out there that can deal with those sort of criminal acts. However, does a university want to criminalize a student for, in some ways, yeah, breaking the law, but they are a student, they're on university premises, their right to freedom of speech has crossed the line. But does a university want to be criminalizing a student, university staff taking hold of a student from a university building and throwing them out of the building? No, they don't. Do the police want to do that? No, they don't. So it's a really difficult situation to put your security staff in. Security staff are not police. They do not have the warranted powers that police have. Do we want the police coming on site like Columbia and tear gas? No, we don't. So it's a very difficult situation to put universities in. And as a result, it's a really difficult grey area to put your university security staff into, because they're not trained to deal with public order incidents. And the police don't want to, and rightly so. Nobody wants to have those pictures put on social media. The unfortunate thing around that is social media is not controlled by universities, it's controlled by protesters. The protesters, some are students and have that right to freedom of expression, The unfortunate thing is, because of some face coverings, it is very difficult to identify who those people are and whether or not they are students. And that then makes it difficult. What we've found in the last 3 or 4 months since the new semester started for the UK in September is the protests have not been as aggressive, or violent is probably the wrong word, criminal, as they were last year. And I'm not sure why that is. I think potentially it's 12 months on. The new student, the new cohort of students are not as engaged in the Palestinian argument that's taking place. I think there are a lot of other things going on in the world now, more than what was 12 months ago. So I don't think there's the same appetite. There is still some people protesting, and the free speech that they've had is fine. I think the other thing for me is that higher education institutions have always had policies and procedures to deal with these sort of events. However, we've never really had to engage in that level of disciplinary process. And I think what's happened over the last 12 months is universities have got hold of those policies. They've reviewed them, because they probably haven't been reviewed for years and years. And they've now made sure that those policies are tight, and therefore student discipline is taking place in a number of universities. And as a result, students are now considering, do I want to stay at university? Is there a potential that I could be released because of the activity that I'm taking place, or not? So things have changed over the last sort of six to where we were 12 months ago. And each university in the UK is different. As I said earlier on, I worked in York. I worked for 10 years. The protests in the encampment at York were very organised, very controlled, and the university had a fantastic liaison officer that worked with the group. We allowed rallies to take place, we allowed marching around the university, we allowed protests, and they agreed to those boundaries. As Mal said, there are boundaries there, and at York they agreed to them. At Leeds that was totally different, and therefore the encampment was larger, the activism was larger, and it was a lot more aggressive towards staff than it probably certainly was in York. And that's a difference of 20 miles. So each university had to deal with their own situation and manage it in their own way.
You touch on a really great point, both of you, in terms of establishing some clear boundaries and demarcation of that enables the institution to ensure and maintain safety whilst balancing the right to protest, etc. How do you manage that when you have outside agitators who come and get involved in some of these activities, whose sole purpose is to cross those boundaries? So you're not just managing the safety and welfare of the immediate community within the university, but there's a consideration of, is it a different set of red lines for those outside agitators? Mal, how do you deal with that?
There was engagement. It's nothing simple about it at all. It was a matter of early engagement with the students who you knew to be students, and building a rapport with those individuals, allowing them a safe environment for them to approach you if it was required. And I vividly remember a discussion I had with the protest encampment leader at my university. And I said, we are concerned that there would be outside agitators, and we want you to feel comfortable in letting us know if that occurs. It didn't occur with us. To answer part of your question, engagement is one element of it, but it's also, as Jeff pointed out, actually using the already existing policies and procedures for university to make sure that we keep a safe place. I saw it play out at other universities in Australia where they did lose control essentially of the type of people that were involved in their encampment, and it was a much more difficult thing to manage. It was a far greater risk. They had awful things occurring within their encampments and so forth. We were quite lucky. I consider what we had to be encampment light, if you like, and I think we dodged a bullet to some degree, but I think that may have also been good management, not on my part, but also on part of my colleagues and so forth, who we imposed restrictions, things like getting together without putting some physical boundaries in place and isolating the encampment from a psychosocial perspective, with the intent of protecting the rest of the student body and the staff members from those who might be affected by what they're seeing within the encampment, and restricting access, still talking to the individuals within the encampment, but also doing work outside that. There's an intelligence gathering piece also, and if those of us who've worked in policing are very au fait with getting to know who's who in the zoo and what their motivations are, and ensuring that there are always different motivations, and having an understanding of what that actually might be allows you to find a strategy to try and mitigate some of the risk that's involved in that.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, outside actors and agitators causing, perhaps stirring things up in a negative way. How have you been able to manage those situations?
Yeah, it's. I don't think we have, to be perfectly honest. I think it's a really difficult task. There are a number of websites that some of the activists are using to influence protesters in relation to legal requirements for the police and for university security staff, as in at most universities, if security asks for your student identification because you're in a building or whatever that might be, to verify that you are a student, the regulations rules are that you need to give your student ID. If your face is covered and you refuse to give those details, it's going back to that fine line of how do you deal with that from a security point of view. Yes, there is legislation to remove somebody from that building, but do our security staff trained enough to be able to remove somebody from the building in certain circumstances when there's going to be no onward activism? Then you can remove somebody because they're more likely to leave as a result. But if they want to stay in the building, then it becomes a really difficult situation. We have really good relations with the local police in West Yorkshire. We actually have a police liaison officer who sits in the security office at Leeds. So that helps. And we work tirelessly with West Yorkshire Police operations team to share information, such as when protests are going to take place. If they're going to take place in the centre of Leeds, there is a likelihood that they will move up to the university. It's only half a mile outside of the city centre. So that relationship with the police, that relationship of sharing information is vital, but it is extremely difficult. It's difficult to identify if they're a student or an external activist who wants to be involved.
Yeah. And you touch on a really interesting point here. You reference building occupation. So, as, for example, student protest becomes more agitated and graduates to become a more serious incident that involves disruption to business operations, for example, building occupation, perhaps starts to extend out into the wider community and jeopardizing the wider safety across the organization. How do you both constantly risk assess, constantly make dynamic decisions about the appropriate level of response in dealing what is a constantly changing picture that involves communication, not only to your own executive teams and critical incident management teams, but potentially with outside agencies as well, and indeed the student body, as situations are constantly morphing?
I think from our perspective, the critical incident management team scenario that you've just articulated, it was a key driver in the decision making around the type of response that we would actually like to do and try and achieve. and then it's a collaboration. It's kind of managing upward. I need to be able to manage the critical incident management team. I need to articulate what we can actually do here. Be very clear, managing upward and saying, this is what we can achieve with the resources that we've got. Have a think about this. This was what the scenario might play out, and then building a relationship not only with the CIM team, with executive level within the university, but also with our policing colleagues around what they can assist us with and what they are seeing develop. A lot of the way the university protest scenario was playing out was you could clearly see their tactics were improving as they went along. They were collaborating as well. We were seeing what was going on in the US and the UK and in Europe, and we were a little behind that, and they were able to actually use that as a bit of a learning tool and adapt and change a little bit. But I think having a very clear understanding from your executive what they want to actually do, and then assist them in deciding how we're going to actually go about achieving that is a key consideration in my view of how it played out. And I think that probably saved a lot of drama is one way of describing it, but assuaging the reputational risk that they might lose by actually going it hard or stupidly around trying to get rid of an encampment for no real good reason.
Jeff, same question to you.
I think the key thing for me is a number of universities, the critical incident management executives, they have an understanding of the university and how it runs. I think the essential thing for me is to make sure that your security manager, head of security, and there are different levels depending on your institution. Some institutions sit with facilities, some institutions it's with estates. When I was at York, it was student academic services. The critical incident management team needs to have a security element, a security expert on that to advise on the security element of the incident. And that's key to me. The security manager, the head of security at an institution, is that link between the police service that is within your area and also the staff that are going to be expected to try and deal with it. So that is the critical element for me, is to make sure that security managers are involved in that discussion. There are major discussions that go on within that, how to manage it, how to risk assess it. Is it students? Is it external? What is the building that's being occupied? What's the business as usual element of that particular building? Can it be moved somewhere else? So there are all sorts of elements that need to be discussed at that. But the critical part to me is to ensure that somebody from security is involved in that.
Yeah. And in terms of, what determines success or failure as part of that critical incident management and response, I guess that a question I've got for both of you, can you think of a couple of examples where you've seen a particular action being taken that has actually materially impacted positively or negatively, without naming names or resulting in any legal cases for us, please. But any particular examples of great practice, operational execution versus things that have just resulted in a situation further escalating and becoming more serious through inaction or other aspects of the response. Mal, to you first.
Yeah, from my perspective, it's actually relatively easy and it's a positive thing. And I think so ours wasn't a building occupation, it was a literal encampment, bring your tent along and, sit around the campfire scenario. But it was the collegiate response from the university and in bringing our OH&S, as I mentioned earlier, our OH&S colleagues in to assess it from a risk assessment OH&S lens. And it's as opposed to the hard and fast criminal matter, trespass, breaking of university regulations lens. And I think and unemotional approach and actually looking at what could we do materially to actually de-escalate this or keep people safe, and that and as I mentioned earlier, that was simply ringing it, and was that I mean a plastic tape, and just putting a visible barrier around that space and delineating the encampment from the rest of the university. And what that actually did was, it didn't stop anything. It was a very porous boundary, but what it did was provided a clear boundary that people could choose to cross or choose not to cross. And those who choose not to be engaged, if that was their choice, that they would go around it and they would not have to be confronted with it. And it took the heat out of that, that the confrontational nature of what was going on. It was a massive win for us. And I got to admit, when the CIMT wanted my OH&S colleagues to come at it from that perspective, I was quite happily to say I was very skeptical about how that might play out. But it was probably the key element to what ended up being a relatively successful de-escalation of issue for us.
Jeff, same question to you. Any particular sort of learnings and examples of either very good or opportunities for improvement? Let's put it like that.
Yeah, I think the thing for me is expect the unexpected. And as time rolled on in relation to protests, universities put operational orders in place. They have briefings, they advise staff, they do all sorts. So at York, we had graduation, and we had worked tirelessly with the executive, the panel, the graduation ceremony people, everything. We'd put a fantastic operational order in place to make sure all the graduations went ahead with, even if there was disruption, we knew what we was going to do. There were trigger words, there was everything. And when I say expect the unexpected, you cannot guarantee what parents are going to do at their child's graduation. And when a small protest appeared at one of our graduations, security had nothing to do with it. Parents removed the protesters. So you can plan, you can put everything in place, but expect the unexpected.
Yeah, that's probably a great a great tip. And I guess, one of the things, expect the unexpected, but as we try and anticipate the unexpected, are there any particular things, or trends that you're seeing either within the student body that are now present at universities, that perhaps, the temperature, the mood was different only a short time ago, like parental intervention, for example? Are there any trends that you're seeing that are affecting how organizations need to respond in order to maintain safety and security within the community? Mal, over to you.
It was really interesting. I think post the encampment, there was a number of disciplinary matters, student disciplinary matters that occurred. And it was based on the footage that we were able to obtain from our CCTV systems or our body-worn cameras and that sort of stuff, and holding people to account with regard to the already in place codes of conduct and so forth. So that occurred. And so people were held to account, and they realised, I can be held to account now. The other thing that was a major game changer was, I think, the need for the protesters to legitimise. And the way that they did that was they got themselves elected to Students' Union. They stood for election. In some cases they were elected, some cases they weren't elected. But because of the fact that they wanted to legitimise, they had to get out of this just outside the circle scenario. They needed to come inside the tent, if you like. That's one way I always used to describe it. They couldn't stay outside the tent and throw stones at the tent. They needed to come inside the tent. And, that actually changed the dynamic a lot around the way that they approached freedom of speech at the university and so forth. The trends that I can see occurring now is that these people won't go away. And a lot of it, and Jeff mentioned it before, it's not simply about the topic du jour at the moment. It's about what will come in the future. And that might be the Trump administration gets elected, Syria, the crisis within Syria changes, Ukraine changes. It could be in something we've not seen coming yet, and they will jump on that and use that as a tool by which that they promote themselves and promote their ideologies and so forth. So expect the unexpected is a great way to describe it, but we can manage the situation more effectively when they're happy to be inside the tent.
Yeah, great. Jeff?
I think for me, a lot of universities are looking towards Birmingham University at the moment. I believe they were the first university to go down the line of getting a High Court injunction and a possession order for persons unknown. And they have put that legislation in place for a period of time. As a result, they have seen a marked reduction in the number of protests. The protesters are now given guidelines and rules in which they can still protest, because that freedom of expression, right to free speech still needs to take place, because that's fundamental to students and university sort of mantra. But it's interesting, and I believe a number of universities are looking to what happens at Birmingham, because they had it really rough to begin with, and it will be interesting to see now legislation is in place and they're not using their security staff to deal with a protest. They will bring in the High Court bailiffs as a result of the injunction. So it will be interesting to see how that works and whether or not other universities decide to follow suit. And massive sort of plaudits to Birmingham University for being, I believe they were the first to actually go down that line, because it is a really difficult thing to do, to take legislative action against your students.
Yeah, and one of the things I'm interested in both of your perspectives. I think a lot of the protests that we've seen, certainly in recent times, has been aimed at the institution, at the wider organization, you know, whether it's to do with associations with things like defense contractors, for example, or you know, support for various causes and associations, partnerships, etc. To what extent is there a threat that you have seen where that organizational focus shifts towards a focus to specific executives, vice chancellors, leadership within universities, and how you would sort of pivot your posture and readiness to deal with a critical incident, albeit not of a wide scale protest, but a very targeted attack on individuals and executive members of your institution or universities at large. Is that something that you consider? Is it something that you've already seen, Mal, and are prepared for?
Yep, 100%. And it absolutely is the case that we have planned for that. We have had to execute those plans because we've seen a small number of protesters pivot from being that wide, as you say, that wide scale, fairly generalized thing, and trying to make a point. And it's usually a social media point or a wider media point of actually attacking university executive directly, confronting those individuals. So actively engaging with the Vice Chancellor's office and talking about their itinerary, their movements, that kind of stuff, planning for how we're going to do that. I had a security officer today being essentially a CPP detail for our Vice Chancellor at an award ceremony, because we've had some scenarios play out made and people have confronted the Vice Chancellor. And that might simply be as a product of these external events, but it also might be internal. We're going through an EBA negotiation or a major workplace change scenario at the moment. Most universities are going through that in Australia at the moment. And the focus, particularly for people who are a bit unhinged or a bit, you know, so they've got skin in the game, if you like. They go to the top. They want a person to be held responsible. So you need to plan for that. You need to plan for that. You need to be able to execute those plans, and you need to practice it. And that's exactly what we've had to do.
Yeah. Jeff, are you seeing the same sorts of of things and preparing for those sorts of more individually targeted type actions?
Not in the same way, to be perfectly honest. The majority of vice chancellors that I know want to be available to students and feel they need to be available. Our previous vice chancellor at Leeds, we had a lock-in strategy within the vice chancellor's main building. We have a brand new vice chancellor who has agreed to a different profile for that particular building. So certainly UK wise, there are the odd number of incidents where executives have been challenged. They seem to be accepting of the fact that they are a vice chancellor and they need to be able to engage with students. So from a policing background, if that changes, I have a plan in place in which to be able to deal with that. But at the moment, the majority of vice chancellors want to be available to students because they feel that that's part of their role.
Yeah, and actually, I'm just going to move to some of the questions that we've got. And Don Faculty from University of Reading asked the question, and it's a very nice segue into the point that you've just made there, Jeff. How do institutions and indeed, VCs and members of the leadership strike the right balance between respecting the rights of protest, maintaining public safety and indeed their own safety when making themselves accessible, but of course ensuring that ongoing safety and security across the campus environment? Do you want to just respond to that straight away, Jeff, in terms of that position of VCs wanting to be accessible and available and visible, that there being a balance, not just for individuals, but perhaps for the organisation more generally?
Yeah, so certainly at York, when we were there, VC was very open. He would engage with the encampment to begin with, but that was on almost diarised. So there would be an engagement over a particular time, particular date, particular location in which he can manage that. He was more than happy to be out and about on his own. He didn't class himself as being vulnerable in that aspect. Other universities will have different aspects, and that's down to each security manager, executive to make that decision. Certainly at Leeds, our brand new vice chancellor wants to be open, wants to have visibility within the university, and sees herself as being the head of the university. But as a university, we've got 40,000 students. The majority of those students are not involved in protests and not involved in activism. And therefore, she sees that that is an element of her role, that she needs to be visible for that and needs to be an open campus. I have my own views as an ex-police officer, but we have to respect the views of our vice chancellor, and if there is a requirement to change that, then we're capable of doing that.
Great, Mal, over to you.
Yeah, I totally agree with Jeff. Most vice chancellors actually want to be seen to be, the leader of the people, essentially. They are a figurehead role. I think the only risk, or one of the risks that comes out of that, is if someone wants to make a point for social media, that they might use an opportunity to be face to face with a person of authority to make that point. And I think it's just a matter of reading the room a little bit. The way that I think the way that we struck a balance between respecting protest rights and maintaining the public safety was the hive mind, if you like, of the CIMT process at each individual university. A different point of view from each of those really key people, very intelligent, very experienced, and coming to a collegiate response, essentially. That worked really well. And I see one of my colleagues, Rick Liddy, who lives in Queensland, a beautiful place in the world. talks about, you know, the sharing of information that we have within the OXO group. We had a weekly meeting where we shared that information, and we talked about what was working, what wasn't working, what were the tactics, and all those kind of stuff. And we utilised those in each of our campuses to maintain that balance, and it worked really, really well.
Yeah, and I think I'm just looking at one of the next questions, and it ties to some of the complexities associated with legislation and the sort of profile of university settings and the adjacencies of other facilities, owners and operators of public accessible spaces, where you've got mixed operating environments, you've got accommodation, you've got retail, other commercial services that sit alongside, you know, the core academic activities of universities. Derek Scott, his question is, one of the aspects of the Terrorism Protection Bill is the need to collaborate with the organizations that I've just mentioned. How does that change your approach, and what challenges do you think this will present for you? Mal, to you first.
Yeah, we can't work in isolation. It's really that simple. I make it a point to meet with whomever is my equivalent at the adjacent institution, the retail environment, wherever we've got a campus. I've got 2 major campuses and a couple of smaller campuses, and one of those is right next to a 10-story hospital. And so I've got a relationship with those individuals, because you can't do this in isolation, and invariably a critical incident that affects me will affect them. And you don't want to be maintaining that relationship or starting that relationship at the outset of a critical incident. You want to have those contact points. And I think we all work, and Jeff will be no different, I'm sure, and all the colleagues that I can see work on our ability to maintain relationships with those external to the university or to the institution we work with, and, you know, the industry or whatever is beside us, around us, that we collaborate with.
Yes, same question to you, Jeff.
Yeah, like Mal said, you cannot work in isolation. OXO is a fantastic association for higher education, both in the UK, Europe, and globally. You know, I've been down to Australia and met many of the team from the Australasia region. But it's not just about higher education. In Leeds, there are 3 universities, and I'm already talking to members of Leeds Beckett and Leeds Trinity. We have Leeds General Infirmary next door to us, and part of our buildings, and within that there is an association called NAS, for the National Health Association for Security, that we are working in collaboration with. We have to work together. We have to have almost an alliance to be able to work out what's going on in Leeds, because if there is a major incident, a critical incident, it is going to affect the police. It is going to affect the medical facilities. You know, we have to be able to work together. One of my colleagues from Leeds Trinity was talking about and I can't remember the association, but it was a Leeds-based, almost Leeds City Council transport group that used to work together. I think since COVID, everything happened since COVID, and we're on about trying to re-establish that, because we are expecting something. You know, the threat level at the UK is substantial. So we need to be able to prepare for that, and you can't do it as in isolation. It's impossible.
Yeah, and just one final point. Les Allen from Heriot-Watt and former chair of OXO makes the comment that you touched on earlier, Jeff, about the sort of modernisation, transformation of sort of a more property and asset oriented function in keeping universities secure towards more of a people oriented service that really underpins the staff and student experience. What's next as part of that modernization? What can your teams, your colleagues do? If just one thing, so I'm conscious of time, Is there a particular initiative that you'd like to embed as a capability as part of your service offering, part of your function?
Just by way of like thanks, Les Allen is probably the king of that transformation. I've got to say that safeguarding scenario at Heriot-Watt has been replicated across the world, and it is we need to get better. We are getting better, and I think that putting our security officers and our campus, my guys are campus support people, they're security, but they're campus support people, through mental health first aid training and those kinds of training programs, and getting better at that. Infrastructure failure as being a major issue that we might deal with, it's usually people driven, and it is usually a trigger point, and being able to recognize that and then intervene prior to it becoming a massive issue is key, I think, and can save us a lot of drama down the track.
Yeah. Jeff, any thoughts on that point?
Yeah, very, very similar to Mal. Yeah, big shout out to Les. As I say, as Mal indicated, the transformation that took place at Heriot-Watt was significant for me coming into higher education. It's why we changed at York to a campus safety team. What we're looking to do at Leeds is something similar. The original security position has changed. Students are customers. That's where we need to be. But the major issue for me is the technology. Technology is out there. We need to utilize technology a lot more. And I have been very lucky that Leeds are looking to improve the technology. Some of the technology that we've got is quite old. The infrastructure is not there, but there is a massive project that we're looking to implement to improve that, to make it a safer space, basically around Martin's Law. But as we've all identified, both Mal and his colleagues down in Australia, my European colleagues, and in the UK, we are here to enhance the student experience while they're in university. And if we can do that by making it a safe space for the technology that's out there and for the staff that the security teams put out to make sure, like Mal's just said, mental health first aid, safeguarding opportunities, directing. And one of the things that my sort of mantra was, security staff are a mobile signpost. If you're walking down a street, you see a signpost and it points you in the right direction. The security staff are mobile and they will signpost you. They are not police officers. They're not counsellors. They're not the fire brigade. They are a mobile signpost that will point you in the right direction, whether that's support within the university or external support, professional support that's available. So that is the drive for me at Leeds, and I think the same at a number of universities that want to transform their teams.
Well, that's a great concluding statement, I think, Jeff. So thank you for that. It's been a fantastic webinar. I think we've meandered very nicely across a number of related topics, and I'm sure our attendees have found it useful, regardless of where they are located around the world. There's just one final point that John at Northumbria wanted to ask, and it relates to how many points the Lions are going to put on the Wallabies. But unfortunately, we've run out of time, so Mal, you won't be able to give a suitable response. So with that, I'd just like to thank you both for participating in this session, your support and working with us here at CriticalArc, and our partnership with both your organizations as you deploy safe zones to keep your community safe is really appreciated and valued. So thank you again for joining in what was a really useful and valuable discussion this morning.